The year was 1940, and Europe had become an inferno of conquest and bloodshed. Germany's military forces, operating with a precision and ferocity that had stunned the world, had crushed one nation after another in a sequence of lightning victories that seemed almost choreographed in their brutal efficiency. Poland had fallen first, overwhelmed in a matter of weeks by a new kind of warfare that combined air power and armoured divisions in ways the world had never witnessed. Denmark and Norway had been next, swallowed up in operations that demonstrated the Wehrmacht's ability to strike across vast distances with devastating effect. Now, in the spring and early summer of that terrible year, France itself was crumbling under the German onslaught, a collapse so swift and complete that it defied belief among those who remembered the grinding stalemate of the previous World War. The British Expeditionary Force found itself cornered on the beaches of Dunkirk, facing annihilation with the cold waters of the English Channel at their backs and German forces tightening the noose around them. Paris, the City of Light, now saw Nazi banners hanging from its most cherished monuments, a sight that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The swastika flag flew from the Eiffel Tower, a symbol of how completely the balance of power in Europe had shifted. In this moment of seemingly unstoppable German triumph, one man stood at the pinnacle of both military achievement and political influence within Adolf Hitler's regime. This was Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall, commander of the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, and by most accounts the second most powerful figure in the entire Third Reich. From his luxurious command posts, surrounded by the trappings of his success and the spoils of conquered territories, Göring had every reason to believe in the invincibility of the German war machine he had helped to build. Across the Atlantic Ocean, separated from this European catastrophe by thousands of miles of water, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt observed the unfolding disaster with growing alarm. The president understood that the ocean might not remain a sufficient barrier if Britain fell and if the Nazi regime consolidated its control over all of Europe's industrial resources. Roosevelt knew that American involvement might become inevitable, but he also knew that the United States was woefully unprepared for modern warfare on the scale that Germany had demonstrated. The American military was small, poorly equipped, and operating with outdated doctrines and aging equipment. The nation's industrial capacity, while substantial, was almost entirely oriented toward consumer goods and civilian production. Something dramatic would have to change if America were to have any hope of defending itself or its interests in a world increasingly dominated by aggressive totalitarian powers. In May of 1940, Roosevelt appeared before the United States Congress to deliver a message that struck many listeners as bordering on delusional fantasy. The president requested that the nation prepare itself to manufacture an astonishing 50,000 military aircraft annually. To understand just how outlandish this goal seemed to contemporary observers, consider that during the entire previous year, 1939, American factories had managed to produce only 2,141 military planes combined. The entire American aviation sector was essentially a collection of small specialized workshops compared to the massive industrial establishments that had been built up in Germany over the preceding years. The German aircraft industry, by contrast, had already demonstrated its ability to produce military planes by the thousands, supporting operations across multiple fronts simultaneously. Roosevelt's proposal to quintupling production almost overnight seemed like the desperate proclamation of a leader grasping at straws, making promises that had no basis in reality, simply to calm public fears or rally national morale. When word of Roosevelt's ambitious declaration reached Hermann Göring in his headquarters, the Reichsmarschall's reaction was predictably dismissive. Surrounded by his senior officers, all of them flush with the success of their recent campaigns and confident in the superiority of German military technology and doctrine, Göring treated the American president's announcement as nothing more than a humorous curiosity. The very notion that the United States, a nation that Göring viewed as soft, undisciplined, and obsessed with commercial trivialities, could suddenly transform itself into a military-industrial powerhouse struck him as absurd. According to accounts from those present, Göring expressed his contempt in terms that would later take on a bitterly ironic significance. "The Americans," he declared with obvious scorn, "excel at manufacturing refrigerators and razor blades." The implication was clear. A country that focused on consumer conveniences and commercial products lacked the martial spirit, the industrial discipline, and the technical sophistication necessary to produce the complex machinery of modern warfare. This single moment of dismissive arrogance, this confident assertion that America posed no serious industrial threat to German ambitions, would prove to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in military history. Göring's laughter, his casual dismissal of American capabilities, represented not just personal hubris, but a deep-seated ideological blindness that pervaded Nazi thinking about the United States. That moment of mockery was, in retrospect, the calm before an unprecedented storm. It was the moment when a challenge was inadvertently issued, though Göring had no intention of challenging anyone. He simply could not conceive that his assessment might be wrong. He could not imagine that his words were not the final judgment on American capabilities, but rather the opening statement in a contest that would end with his own complete defeat. The dismissal was not merely an error in judgment about industrial capacity. It was a fundamental failure to understand the nature of American society, the depth of its resources, and the potential that lay dormant in a nation that had not yet fully committed itself to total war. What Göring did not realize, what he could not realize given his ideological preconceptions, was that his contemptuous remarks about refrigerators and razor blades were not an ending but a beginning. America would indeed meet the challenge, though the challenge had been unintentionally issued. The response would come not in the form of speeches or diplomatic protests, but in the form of an industrial mobilization so vast and so rapid that it would fundamentally alter the strategic balance of the entire war. A tidal wave of production was building, though in May 1940 it was still invisible to those who dismissed American potential. Steel, aluminum, engines, aircraft, tanks, ships, all the machinery of modern warfare, would soon begin pouring forth from American factories in quantities that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. This industrial tsunami would not simply challenge the Third Reich. It would overwhelm it, bury it, and ultimately destroy it. The story of how this transformation occurred, how a nation that Göring had dismissed as irrelevant became the arsenal that supplied the Allied victory, is a tale of genius, determination, hard work, and the fatal consequences of underestimating one's adversaries. It is the story of how one man's arrogant certainty awakened a giant that had been sleeping, and how that giant, once roused, proved unstoppable. To truly comprehend the magnitude of Hermann Göring's error, to understand why his dismissal of American industrial power represented such a profound failure of strategic thinking, one must first understand the man himself and the worldview that shaped his perceptions. By the year 1940, Göring was far more than simply a military commander. He had become a living embodiment of Nazi success, a symbol of the regime's apparent invincibility and its promise to restore German greatness. His personal history made him an ideal representative for Nazi propaganda. During the First World War, Göring had been a fighter pilot, and not just any pilot, but a decorated ace who had achieved fame in combat. He had eventually taken command of the Jagdgeschwader 1, the famous flying circus squadron that had originally been led by Manfred von Richthofen, the legendary Red Baron. This connection to Germany's military traditions and its heroes from the previous war gave Göring a legitimacy that many other Nazi leaders lacked. After the war, Göring had attached himself to Adolf Hitler's nascent political movement and had risen through the party ranks to become one of the Führer's most trusted deputies. He held multiple positions of power, controlling not just the Luftwaffe, but also having influence over economic policy and the machinery of repression that kept the Nazi regime in power. Göring cultivated a personal image that was deliberately larger than life. He dressed in elaborate, specially designed uniforms that seemed more suited to an opera stage than a military headquarters. He surrounded himself with looted art treasures and lived in ostentatious luxury even by the standards of the Nazi elite. In his own mind, and in the carefully constructed image presented to the German public, Göring was a Renaissance figure, a man of culture and refinement as well as military prowess, someone who represented the best of German civilization and power combined into a single personality. His public statements during this period reflected an almost boundless confidence that frequently crossed over into outright hubris. As Germany prepared for war and then launched its attacks on Poland, Göring made pronouncements that demonstrated absolute certainty in German superiority. One of his most famous boasts concerned the industrial heartland of Germany, the Ruhr Valley, where much of the nation's coal mining and steel production was concentrated. Göring declared publicly that no enemy bomber would ever reach the Ruhr, and he stated this with such conviction that he added a personal guarantee. He proclaimed that if a single enemy plane ever succeeded in bombing the Ruhr, people could stop calling him by his own name and should instead call him Meyer, which was a common German surname. The implication was that such an event was so impossible that he was willing to stake his very identity on its never occurring. This was not just confidence. It was absolute, unshakable certainty in German defensive capabilities and in the impossibility of enemy forces penetrating German airspace. When the Luftwaffe prepared to launch its campaign against Great Britain following the fall of France, Göring's boasts became even more grandiose. He rhetorically asked his subordinates how long the British could possibly hold out against the might of the German Air Force. His own answer was dismissive of any serious resistance. He suggested that Britain might last 2 weeks, perhaps 3 at most, before being forced to surrender. In Göring's worldview, German forces were simply superior in every meaningful way, and any enemy that faced them was destined for swift and inevitable defeat. This was the mindset that received news of Roosevelt's call for 50,000 aircraft and responded with mocking laughter. It was not merely overconfidence, though overconfidence certainly played a role. It was something deeper and more problematic, a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy based on ideological preconceptions rather than careful analysis. The Nazi worldview saw America as a fundamentally weak nation, weakened by what they perceived as racial mixing and moral decadence. The United States, in their analysis, was a mongrel society without the supposed racial purity that Nazi ideology claimed was the source of German strength. American culture, with its emphasis on individual freedom, its celebration of jazz music and Hollywood entertainment, its focus on commercial success and consumer satisfaction, all of this was seen as evidence of a soft, frivolous civilization that could never match the martial discipline and focused purpose of the Third Reich. America might be good at producing automobiles and household appliances, comfortable consumer goods for comfortable lives, but the Nazis believed that such skills were essentially irrelevant when it came to the serious business of warfare. Making a refrigerator or a razor blade was one thing. Forging the complex weapons systems needed for modern military operations was something else entirely. Something that required not just technical skill but a certain hardness of spirit that the Nazis believed Americans lacked. This ideological blindness was so profound, so deeply embedded in Nazi thinking, that it led Germany's leadership to ignore or dismiss intelligence that contradicted their preconceptions. German military attachés stationed in the United States had been sending reports back to Berlin, and these reports told a very different story from the one that Göring and Hitler wanted to believe. The attachés had toured American factories, had seen the vast industrial infrastructure that existed in cities like Detroit, had observed the extensive railway networks and the access to seemingly unlimited natural resources. Their reports warned that American industrial potential was enormous, far greater than Nazi leaders seemed to realize, and that if this potential were ever fully mobilized for military production, the United States alone could potentially outproduce the entire Axis alliance. These were not vague warnings, but detailed assessments based on direct observation of American capabilities. The reports were ignored or dismissed as exaggerations. The leadership in Berlin simply could not accept that their fundamental assumptions about American weakness might be wrong. They chose to believe that American boasts about industrial capacity were nothing more than propaganda and bluff, empty claims from a nation that was trying to sound more powerful than it actually was. This was a comfortable belief because it confirmed what Nazi ideology already claimed to be true. It allowed German leaders to continue pursuing their military ambitions without worrying about the possibility that they were creating an enemy whose resources might eventually overwhelm them. In later years, after the war had been lost and Göring found himself imprisoned and awaiting trial, he would admit to American interrogators that this had been a catastrophic error in judgment. In prison interviews, Göring confessed that he had genuinely believed the Nazi propaganda about American softness and weakness. He admitted that the famous remark about refrigerators had not been a joke or a casual insult, but reflected his actual assessment of American capabilities. It was, he told his captors with something approaching tragic self-awareness, the greatest miscalculation of his entire life. He added, in words that captured the totality of his error, that the Americans had buried Germany under an avalanche of production, an avalanche that had been invisible until it was too late to escape its path. But in May 1940, that avalanche was still just a rumbling in distant mountains, unnoticed by those who were confident in their own superiority. The world looked at America and saw a nation with fewer than 3,000 military aircraft, an army that was smaller than Portugal's military forces, and a population that was deeply divided about whether the United States should involve itself in yet another European conflict just 2 decades after the previous World War had claimed so many American lives. Göring looked at this picture and saw confirmation of everything he believed. He saw weakness, unpreparedness, lack of martial spirit, a nation unsuited for the demands of modern warfare. What he failed to see, what his ideology prevented him from seeing, was the single factor that would make all the difference in the end. He failed to see the colossal, untapped industrial power that lay dormant in American society, waiting only for the right catalyst and the right leadership to awaken and direct it toward a single purpose. And he failed to recognize that Franklin Roosevelt had already identified the man who could provide that catalyst and that leadership, the man who would take Roosevelt's seemingly impossible goal and make it reality. While Hermann Göring was enjoying the fruits of his victories in Europe, believing himself invincible and dismissing any potential threat from across the Atlantic, a very different sort of individual was living quietly in Detroit, Michigan, completely unaware that he was about to be called upon to change the course of human history. This man's name was William Cygnæus Knudsen, though he was known to almost everyone simply as Bill Knudsen. In almost every conceivable way, Knudsen represented the opposite of everything Hermann Göring embodied. Where Göring was aristocratic, flamboyant, boastful, and obsessed with personal glory and luxury, Knudsen was humble, practical, quiet, and focused entirely on getting work done efficiently. Where Göring represented the supposed superiority of racial purity and national destiny, Knudsen was a Danish immigrant who embodied the American dream of success through hard work and merit, regardless of background or origin. Knudsen had been born in Copenhagen, Denmark, in the year 1879 with the name Cygnæus Wilhelm Paul Knudsen. He had come to the United States at the age of 20 in 1900, arriving like millions of other immigrants with little money, no influential connections, and nothing to rely on except his own skills and determination. His early years in America were spent working in shipyards and railroad repair shops, taking whatever employment he could find while teaching himself to speak English by listening to children playing in the neighborhoods where he lived. It was the classic immigrant story, the kind of narrative that America told about itself, the journey from poverty and obscurity to success and recognition based entirely on individual merit and effort. What set Knudsen apart from many other immigrants was his particular genius for understanding how things worked and how they could be made more efficiently. His first significant opportunity came when he got a job at a bicycle factory that had begun producing parts for a revolutionary new enterprise called the Ford Motor Company. This was in the early years of the automobile industry, when cars were still being built essentially by hand in small workshops, each vehicle a unique creation requiring skilled craftsmen to assemble it piece by piece. Knudsen immediately demonstrated that he possessed an unusual talent, an intuitive understanding not just of how to make one of something, but of how to make thousands or millions of the same thing. He did not think like a craftsman who took pride in the uniqueness of each individual product. Instead, he thought like an engineer who understood that true progress came from standardization, from breaking complex processes down into simple, repeatable steps that could be performed by workers with minimal training, and from organizing production in ways that eliminated waste and maximized output. This was exactly the kind of thinking that Henry Ford was looking for as he attempted to revolutionize automobile manufacturing. Knudsen rose rapidly through the ranks at Ford Motor Company, becoming one of the key architects of the mass production system that would make the Model T automobile an icon of the industrial age. The Model T was not necessarily the best car that could be made, nor was it the most luxurious or the most technically sophisticated. What made it revolutionary was that it could be produced in such enormous quantities and at such a low price that it made automobile ownership accessible to average working people for the first time in history. This achievement required rethinking every aspect of how manufacturing was organized, and Knudsen was at the center of that rethinking. He understood how to arrange factory floor space for maximum efficiency. He knew how to break down complex assembly tasks into simple operations that could be performed quickly and reliably. He had an instinct for identifying bottlenecks and solving problems before they disrupted production. These were skills that went far beyond simply being a good mechanic or engineer. They represented a kind of genius for understanding industrial systems as a whole. Eventually, Knudsen had a falling out with Henry Ford, who was notoriously difficult to work with and who often fired talented executives for reasons that had more to do with Ford's own personality than with their job performance. In 1922, Knudsen was hired away from Ford by General Motors, the rival automotive corporation that was Ford's chief competitor. At General Motors, Knudsen's star rose even higher and shone even brighter. He was put in charge of the Chevrolet division, which at the time was struggling to compete with Ford's dominant position in the low-cost automobile market. Under Knudsen's leadership, Chevrolet was transformed into a powerhouse that eventually outsold Ford, a remarkable achievement that demonstrated Knudsen's ability not just to manage production, but to understand markets and customers. By 1937, the Danish immigrant who had arrived in America with nothing but determination and skill had risen to become the president of General Motors, which was by that time the largest industrial corporation on the planet, a position that made him one of the most powerful business leaders in the world. In May 1940, the same month that Hermann Göring was laughing at the notion of American industrial might, William Knudsen received a telephone call that would completely change his life. President Roosevelt needed someone who could take his seemingly fantastical goal of producing 50,000 aircraft annually and actually make it happen. The president needed someone who understood mass production at a level that few people in the world could match. He needed someone who could coordinate the efforts of dozens or hundreds of different companies, many of them competitors, and get them all working toward a common goal. He needed someone who could solve problems that no one had ever faced before, because nothing on the scale that Roosevelt envisioned had ever been attempted. He needed Bill Knudsen. Knudsen gathered his family and told them that he was leaving his position at General Motors, walking away from one of the highest-paying jobs in American industry to go work for the government in Washington. When one of his children asked him why he would do such a thing, why he would give up everything he had worked for, his answer was characteristically simple and direct. "This country has been good to me," he said, "and I want to pay it back." It was a statement that reflected Knudsen's fundamental character. He was not motivated by glory or recognition. He was motivated by gratitude and by a sense of duty. Knudsen agreed to work for the United States government for a salary of exactly $1 per year. He became the most famous of what were called the dollar-a-year men, corporate executives who left their lucrative positions in private industry to lend their expertise to the war effort for essentially no pay. These men did not need the money. They could afford to work for free because they were already wealthy from their business careers. What they brought to the government was something far more valuable than their willingness to work without compensation. They brought expertise, experience, connections, and credibility that no government bureaucrat could match. President Roosevelt initially appointed Knudsen to head the Office of Production Management, a new agency created specifically to coordinate the conversion of American industry from civilian to military production. Later, in a move that was unprecedented in American history, Knudsen would be commissioned as a lieutenant general in the United States Army, becoming the only civilian in the nation's history to enter military service at such a high rank without going through any of the usual progression through lower ranks. This extraordinary appointment demonstrated just how critical the government considered Knudsen's mission to be. The task that Knudsen faced was genuinely monumental in scope. He had to convince a deeply competitive and individualistic collection of American companies to set aside their business rivalries, to stop making the profitable civilian products that had made them successful, and to convert their factories to produce the complex machinery of warfare. He was asking companies that had spent decades perfecting the art of making automobiles, refrigerators, washing machines, and other consumer goods to completely retool their facilities and their workforce to make tanks, aircraft, engines, guns, and ammunition. It was the equivalent of asking a master blacksmith to suddenly start making Swiss watches. The skills were different, the processes were different, the tolerances were different, the entire mindset required was different. He had to coordinate not just one company or one industry, but the entire industrial capacity of the nation, bringing together businesses that normally competed fiercely with each other and getting them to cooperate toward a shared goal. And he had to do all of this faster than anyone thought possible, because time was a factor that worked against the Allies with every passing day that Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. Hermann Göring had laughed at a nation of refrigerator makers, dismissing them as incapable of producing serious weapons of war. He was about to discover what happens when a refrigerator maker, guided by a production genius like William Knudsen, decides to build a bomber. The transformation would be so rapid and so complete that it would shock even those who were implementing it. America was about to demonstrate that the skills required to mass-produce consumer goods were not different from the skills needed to mass-produce weapons. They were exactly the same skills, just applied to different products. And America had spent decades perfecting those skills, while Germany had been focused on military production. The laugh was about to die in Göring's throat, though he did not know it yet. The Avalanche was beginning to move. The challenge that William Knudsen faced was not simply large. It was genuinely staggering in its complexity and its scope. Building an automobile and building a military aircraft were two entirely different propositions that required completely different approaches to manufacturing. A typical automobile from the 1940s contained approximately 15,000 individual parts. A B-24 Liberator heavy bomber, by contrast, contained an estimated 480,000 parts. That was not just a difference in quantity. It was a difference that implied fundamentally different levels of complexity in design, assembly, and quality control. Car bodies were stamped from steel using large presses, a process that was relatively straightforward and that Ford and General Motors had perfected over decades. Aircraft structures were built from lightweight aluminum alloys, assembled using thousands upon thousands of rivets, each of which had to be placed precisely to maintain structural integrity and aerodynamic smoothness. The stakes were also entirely different. When an automobile engine failed, the driver ended up stranded on the side of the road, annoyed but safe. When a bomber engine failed during a mission deep over enemy territory, the result could easily be the death of the entire crew. The tolerances were tighter, the complexity was greater, and the consequences of error were immeasurably higher. Many people in the established aviation industry were deeply skeptical that automobile manufacturers could possibly make the transition to building aircraft. Dutch Kindleberger, who was the president of North American Aviation, one of the leading aircraft manufacturers, famously expressed this skepticism in a quote that captured the prevailing wisdom of the time. "You cannot expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight," he said, implying that automobile makers were essentially industrial blacksmiths, capable of bashing metal into rough shapes but lacking the precision and sophistication required for something as delicate and complex as an airplane. What Kindleberger and other skeptics failed to understand was that Bill Knudsen was not just any blacksmith. He was the man who had essentially invented the modern blacksmith shop, who had taken the craft-based approach to manufacturing and transformed it into the science of mass production. If anyone could figure out how to apply mass production techniques to aircraft manufacturing, it was Knudsen. Knudsen immediately began applying the ruthless logic of automotive mass production to what had been essentially a cottage industry. He assembled a team of fellow executives from the automobile industry, men who shared his understanding of how to organize large-scale production. Together, they toured aircraft manufacturing plants around the country to see how planes were currently being built. What they found horrified them from an efficiency standpoint. Aircraft were being constructed one at a time, by hand, almost like bespoke suits being tailored for individual customers. Teams of skilled craftsmen would work on a single plane for weeks or even months, carefully fitting each part, adjusting and readjusting components until everything worked properly. It was a process that produced excellent aircraft, but it was slow, it was labor-intensive, and it was absolutely impossible to scale up to the production levels that Roosevelt had called for. If America continued building planes this way, there was no chance of hitting even a fraction of the 50,000 plane goal. Knudsen's fundamental principle was disarmingly simple but revolutionary in its application to aircraft manufacturing. Any complex process, he believed, could be broken down into a series of smaller, simpler, more manageable steps. The key was to identify those steps, to standardize them so that they could be repeated reliably, and to organize them in a logical sequence that eliminated wasted time and wasted motion. Knudsen envisioned a completely different approach to building aircraft. Instead of having skilled workers assemble an entire plane from beginning to end in one location, he proposed that major components like wings, fuselages, tail assemblies, and engine nacelles should be built as standardized sub-assemblies in specialized factories located all across the country. These factories would each focus on making one particular component, perfecting their processes and achieving high efficiency through repetition. Once completed, these major sub-assemblies would be shipped to massive new final assembly plants, where they would be brought together and integrated into complete aircraft. It was the automotive assembly line concept, but applied to a product far more complex than any automobile and implemented on a scale that the automotive industry itself had never attempted. The transformation of American industry that followed was almost electric in its speed and its totality. General Motors alone, the company that Knudsen had recently led, converted more than 100 different plants from civilian to military production. The Cadillac division, which had made luxury automobiles, began building M5 Stuart light tanks. The Pontiac division started producing anti-aircraft cannons. Buick manufactured Pratt & Whitney engines, the same engines that would power many of the bombers that Hermann Göring had claimed would never exist. Almost overnight, the entire industrial landscape of the United States shifted its focus. The government banned civilian automobile production entirely for the duration of the war, freeing up the entire capacity of the automotive industry for military purposes. Factories that had made washing machines, refrigerators, typewriters, and thousands of other consumer products converted to making weapons, ammunition, military vehicles, and aircraft components. The full might of American manufacturing, the productive capacity that Göring had dismissed as being suitable only for consumer trivialities, turned toward the machinery of war. The numbers tell a story that speaks more powerfully than any description could. In 1939, the United States had produced just over 2,100 military aircraft of all types combined. In 1940, as the conversion was just beginning and most of the changes had not yet taken effect, that number doubled to slightly over 6,000 planes. By 1941, the year when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and the United States formally entered the war, American production had shot up to more than 19,000 military aircraft. That was almost 10 times the production of just 2 years earlier, an achievement that already seemed remarkable. But it was only the beginning. In 1942, as the factory conversions really hit full stride, and as the systems that Knudsen had put in place began operating at their full potential, America produced a staggering 47,836 aircraft, nearly hitting Roosevelt's supposedly impossible goal of 50,000 in just the third year of the build-up, and the production did not stop there or even slow down. In 1943, the number soared to 85,898 aircraft. In the peak production year of 1944, American factories churned out an incredible 96,318 airplanes. To put this in perspective, during the entire duration of the war, the United States produced more military aircraft than Germany and Japan combined. The avalanche that Göring had unknowingly predicted in his mocking dismissal was now thundering down the mountainside, and there was no way to stop it or even slow it down. Of all the symbols of this industrial miracle, of all the extraordinary achievements in production and manufacturing that occurred during this period, none was more powerful or more audacious than a single factory built on a creek bed in rural Michigan. This factory was called Willow Run, and it would become legendary as the ultimate expression of mass production applied to military aircraft. The story of Willow Run began when Charles Sorensen, who was Henry Ford's chief production executive, returned from inspecting the Consolidated Aircraft Company's B-24 manufacturing facility in San Diego, California. Sorensen had been so energized and excited by the challenge of building heavy bombers that he could not sleep that night. Instead, he stayed up and sketched out his vision for a completely new kind of factory, one that would build bombers not by the day or by the week, but literally by the hour. His sketches formed the basis for what would become the Willow Run bomber plant. The factory was designed by Albert Kahn, an architect who specialized in industrial buildings and who had designed many of the automotive plants that had made Detroit the Motor City. The Willow Run plant was on a scale that defied comprehension. The main building was over half a mile long, covering more than 67 acres under a single roof. It was at the time the largest factory building under one roof anywhere in the world. The assembly line that ran through the factory was so long that it had to make a 90-degree turn just to fit on the available property, a turn that became famous in photographs and newsreels of the period. The goal was to build B-24 Liberator heavy bombers using the same mass production techniques that Ford had pioneered for automobiles. The B-24 was a 4-engine heavy bomber designed for long-range missions deep into enemy territory. It was a complex machine that bristled with weapons, packed with sophisticated equipment, and contained an estimated 400,000 rivets alone just to hold the airframe together. The start of production at Willow Run was anything but smooth. The early months were marked by chaos, frustration, and repeated failures. The B-24 Liberator was a notoriously difficult aircraft to manufacture. Ford's engineers, who were accustomed to the relative simplicity of automobile construction, struggled with the complexity of aircraft systems. Early production was plagued by bottlenecks where parts accumulated faster than they could be assembled, by shortages of critical components, by quality control problems that resulted in aircraft that had to be extensively reworked before they could be accepted by the military. The factory was running so far behind schedule and experiencing so many problems that critics gave it a sarcastic nickname. Instead of Willow Run, they called it Will It Run, expressing doubt that it would ever function properly. The skeptics who had claimed that automobile makers could not build aircraft seemed to be vindicated. This is where the genius of men like Knudsen and Sorensen truly demonstrated itself. They did not panic when faced with problems. They did not abandon the concept or fall back on traditional aircraft manufacturing methods. Instead, they tackled each problem systematically, using the same analytical approach that had made them successful in the automotive industry. When riveting by hand proved too slow and too inconsistent in quality, they developed hydraulic riveting machines that could place rivets faster and more reliably than any human worker. When certain assembly tasks proved too complex to be performed efficiently on the main production line, they broke those tasks down into smaller sub-assemblies that could be prepared separately and then integrated into the main line at the appropriate point. They had to deal with a constant stream of design changes coming from the military as combat experience revealed problems or suggested improvements, all while keeping the main production line moving. This was a feat of flexibility and adaptability that Germany's more rigid production system could never match. Slowly but steadily, the problems were solved one by one. The trickle of aircraft coming off the Willow Run production line became a stream. The stream became a river. The river became a flood. By early 1944, the jokes about will it run had completely stopped. No one was laughing anymore. No one was skeptical. Everyone was simply amazed. At its absolute peak of efficiency, the Willow Run factory was rolling a completely finished B-24 Liberator bomber off its mile-long assembly line every 63 minutes. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, a new 4-engine heavy bomber emerged from that factory every single hour. It was a production rate that seemed to defy the laws of physics and economics. One factory, in 1 month of operation, was producing more heavy bombers than some entire nations could produce in a year of maximum effort. At one point, production was running so far ahead of the military's ability to process and distribute the finished aircraft that the Army Air Forces had to ask Ford to actually slow down production. The company was manufacturing bombers faster than the military could train crews to fly them, faster than air bases could be prepared to receive them, faster than they could be transported to combat theatres. The factories were literally running out of places to park the finished airplanes. Hermann Göring had laughed at a country that made refrigerators and razor blades, dismissing it as incapable of producing serious weapons of war. The Ford Motor Company had taken a patch of Michigan farmland near a creek called Willow Run and had built a machine, a production system, that manufactured a 4-engine heavy bomber every single hour. The refrigerator makers had proven that they could build watches after all, and they could build them faster and better than anyone else in the world. The Avalanche was now in full motion, and nothing could stop it. But machines and factories, as impressive as they were, represented only half of the equation that made the arsenal of democracy possible. The other half, arguably the more important half, and certainly the secret weapon that gave America its ultimate advantage, was its people. The Nazi regime relied on a system of forced labour that was both morally monstrous and industrially inefficient. Enslaved workers from conquered territories were forced to work in German factories under brutal conditions. These workers had every reason to sabotage the products they were forced to build, and indeed sabotage was common, leading to weapons and equipment that were plagued with reliability problems. America, by contrast, mobilized a willing, diverse, and motivated workforce that grew larger and more capable as the war progressed. At its peak, the United States aircraft industry alone employed approximately 2 million people. With millions of men joining the armed forces and leaving their civilian jobs behind, a massive labor shortage developed that threatened to derail the entire production mobilization. This vacuum was filled by groups who had never before been a major part of the American industrial workforce. The most iconic symbol of this new workforce was Rosie the Riveter, a cultural figure that represented the millions of women who took jobs in war industries. Across the country, approximately 6 million women joined the war production effort, working in shipyards, aircraft factories, ammunition plants, and countless other facilities. By 1943, women made up a substantial portion of the workforce in the aircraft industry. The Rosie the Riveter image was not just propaganda. It was personified by real women like Rose Monroe, who actually worked as a riveter on B-24 bombers at the Willow Run plant and who appeared in promotional films encouraging other women to join the workforce. These women, and millions like them, proved themselves more than capable of handling the demanding, often dangerous work of building war machines. They learned to operate complex machinery, to read technical blueprints, to perform precision assembly tasks that required both skill and stamina. The notion that women were unsuited for industrial labour was demolished by the reality of their performance. But the Rosies, as important as they were, represented only part of the transformation in the American workforce. The enormous demand for labour broke down social barriers across American society. African Americans, who had faced systematic discrimination in employment before the war, found new opportunities in war industries, though they still faced significant racism and were often relegated to the hardest and lowest-paying jobs. Mexican Americans contributed substantially to the war effort both in factories and in agriculture. The disabled, the elderly, people who would never have been considered employable in peacetime, found that their skills and their willingness to work were needed and valued. For the first time in American history, in places like the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, integrated crews of men and women of all races worked side by side toward a common goal. The National War Labor Board promoted the principle of equal pay for equal work, a radical concept for the time. In practice, wage disparities often persisted, and discrimination remained a serious problem, but the factory floor nevertheless became an unwitting pioneer for social change. The demands of war production forced American society to begin, however incompletely and imperfectly, to recognize that talent and capability were not limited by gender or race. This stood in the starkest possible contrast to the Nazi system. Germany's use of forced labour was not only a moral abomination that represented the depths of human evil, but it was also an industrial liability that undermined the efficiency of German war production. Enslaved workers had every incentive to work as slowly as possible, to steal materials, to damage machinery, and to sabotage the products they were forced to make. Quality control became a nightmare as German supervisors had to constantly watch for deliberate defects in weapons and equipment. The American system, by contrast, thrived on cooperation and mutual commitment. Workers on factory floors felt invested in the success of the war effort. They made suggestions that led to process improvements and efficiency gains. They took pride in their work because they understood that the aircraft, tanks, and weapons they were building would be used by American soldiers, possibly by their own sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers, fighting against tyranny. This proved in the most dramatic way imaginable that a free and motivated workforce operating in a democratic society could outproduce, out-innovate, and outperform even the most brutal totalitarian system. The arsenal of democracy was powered not by slave labour, but by free men and women who chose to contribute to a cause they believed in. For Hermann Göring, the laughter had long since died. The mockery that had come so easily in May 1940 had curdled into a sickening dread as the reality of American production became impossible to ignore. The avalanche of production that he had dismissed as an impossible fantasy was now a daily, crushing reality, appearing in the skies over Germany in the form of vast fleets of bombers that darkened the sun. His boast that no enemy bomber would ever reach the Ruhr had become a bitter, cruel joke. German citizens, huddled in air raid shelters as American and British bombs rained down on their cities night after night, sarcastically referred to the Allied air forces as Meyer's Luftwaffe, a mocking reference to Göring's promise that his name would be Meyer if enemy planes ever bombed Germany. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies just a few years earlier, was now fighting a desperate defensive battle and losing. German fighter pilots, no matter how skilled or how brave, were simply overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of Allied aircraft. For every German plane shot down, the Luftwaffe had to carefully shepherd its dwindling resources to build a replacement. For the American Army Air Forces, a B-24 lost over Germany in the morning could be replaced by another one rolling off the Willow Run assembly line that same afternoon. It was not even a matter of concern. Losses that would have been catastrophic for the Luftwaffe were absorbed by the American production system without even slowing down. The Allies could sustain losses that would have wiped out the German Air Force in a matter of weeks and still grow stronger with each passing month. This numerical superiority enabled the Allies to conduct a round-the-clock bombing campaign that systematically destroyed Germany's ability to wage war. During the day, the American 8th Air Force, flying from bases in England, conducted massive 1,000-plane raids using B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustang fighters that had the range to accompany the bombers all the way to their targets and back. By night, the British Royal Air Force continued the assault with its own heavy bombers. Together, they targeted oil refineries without which German tanks and aircraft could not operate, ball-bearing factories whose products were essential for virtually every piece of military equipment, and the aircraft factories where Germany was desperately trying to build replacement planes. The Luftwaffe, bled white by constant combat and unable to replace its losses, could do little to stop this onslaught. Göring's once mighty air force was being systematically destroyed both in combat and on the ground, where its aircraft were being bombed in their own factories before they could even be completed. The final crushing proof of this industrial superiority came on June 6, 1944, the day that history would remember as D-Day. As the largest invasion fleet ever assembled approached the beaches of Normandy, carrying Allied forces to begin the liberation of Western Europe, 11,000 Allied aircraft controlled the skies above them. 11,000 planes. It was a number that would have seemed like fantasy just 4 years earlier when Göring had laughed at Roosevelt's call for 50,000 planes per year. The once mighty Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe and which had seemed invincible in 1940, could barely scrape together 100 aircraft to oppose the invasion. The disparity was so overwhelming that it ceased to be a contest. It was simply annihilation. The game was over, though the fighting would continue for almost another year. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Hermann Göring found himself stripped of his medals, his power, his influence, and his dignity. The man who had been the second most powerful figure in the Third Reich was now a prisoner, held in a cell awaiting trial for war crimes at Nuremberg. During the trial, Göring was confronted with the evidence of his catastrophic miscalculations. American prosecutors, led by Robert Jackson, presented him with documentation of America's production miracle. They showed him lists that seemed to go on forever, lists of ships, tanks, aircraft, weapons, ammunition, all the output of American industry during the war years. The numbers were so large as to seem almost incomprehensible. When confronted with reports from his own Luftwaffe intelligence service detailing the technical superiority and overwhelming numerical advantage of American aircraft, Göring could no longer maintain his bluster or his denial. The truth was too obvious, too well documented, too crushing to argue against. In a prison interview conducted in 1945, Göring finally confessed the strategic blindness that had doomed his regime and cost millions of lives. He admitted that he had believed his own propaganda about American weakness and softness. He acknowledged that he, more than many other Nazi leaders, should have had some understanding of American industrial potential, but that he had allowed ideology and prejudice to cloud his judgment. He admitted that the famous remark about Americans being good at making refrigerators and razor blades had not been a joke or a throwaway line, but had represented his genuine assessment of American capabilities. It was, he told his interrogators with something resembling tragic awareness, the greatest miscalculation of his entire life. He added a final thought that captured the totality of his error in words that were almost poetic in their devastating simplicity. "The Americans buried us," he said, "under an avalanche of production. Göring was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and was sentenced to death by hanging. In a final act of defiance, he cheated the hangman by taking his own life with a cyanide capsule just hours before his scheduled execution. But his fate had actually been sealed much earlier, not in a courtroom, but in that moment in May 1940, when he had chosen to laugh at a sleeping giant, when he had dismissed American industrial power as irrelevant, when he had allowed his ideological convictions to blind him to reality. That moment of arrogant certainty had set in motion events that would lead inexorably to his destruction and the destruction of the regime he had served. This story represents far more than simply an interesting historical anecdote or a tale of wartime production. It stands as a powerful lesson about the dangers of hubris, the folly of underestimating one's adversaries, and the fatal consequences of allowing ideology to override rational analysis. The Allied victory in World War II was certainly won by the courage, skill and sacrifice of soldiers, sailors and airmen on the front lines who fought and often died in the struggle against tyranny. But that victory was made possible by something that happened far from the battlefields, in the factories and shipyards and production facilities of the American home front. It was made possible by the quiet genius of men like William Knudsen, who understood how to organize industrial production on an unprecedented scale. It was made possible by the unheralded work of millions of ordinary American citizens who answered their nation's call, who transformed their automobile factories into bomber plants, who left comfortable jobs to work long hours in war industries, who proved through their efforts that the true strength of a nation lies not in its boasts or its propaganda, but in its ability to mobilize its resources and its people toward a common purpose. Hermann Göring had laughed at America's refrigerators and razor blades, seeing them as symbols of weakness and frivolity. What he failed to understand was that a nation that could build millions of refrigerators could build millions of anything once it decided to do so. The skills were transferable, the industrial infrastructure was adaptable, the workforce was capable. The only thing that had been missing was the motivation and the leadership to direct all of that potential toward a single goal. Franklin Roosevelt had provided the vision with his call for 50,000 planes. William Knudsen had provided the expertise to make that vision reality. And millions of ordinary Americans had provided the labor that turned vision and expertise into actual aircraft, actual tanks, actual ships, actual weapons that buried the Third Reich under that avalanche of production that Göring had finally acknowledged in his prison cell. The story of the arsenal of democracy is ultimately a story about the fatal consequences of underestimating America's industrial power, and about how the United States proved, conclusively and overwhelmingly, that it could rise to meet any challenge once fully committed to doing so.